Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Oaks Countdown. Nicole Russo in Lexington, Kentucky, and Dan Illman in our New York studio. And we'll begin this episode, as we usually do, by taking a look at the current point standings toward a spot in the 14-horse starting gate for the Kentucky Oaks. And the field is really starting to form up following last weekend's three major prep races. You see the newcomer to the list, Ashland winner, out for a spin. Gazelle winner Always Shopping is actually considered much more likely to pass on the Oaks in favor of waiting for the Black-Eyed Susan at Pimlico, so we're not really going to key in on her at the moment. Some movement still very possible on here, with the Fantasy still to be run, Gazelle runner-up Positive Spirit not certain to press on to the Oaks, and Serengeti Empress's status still uncertain. But one thing that isn't uncertain is Bellafina's status as the Kentucky Oaks favorite. The filly remained perfect this season with this impressive win in the Santa Anita Oaks, Dan.
No doubt about it. I mean, it was only a four-horse field, unfortunately, but Bellafina got the nice trip on the outside. We see she was a little bit late to make her final lead change, but once she does, she draws away from this overmatched field, and what can you say? This is her third Grade 1 stakes victory. She is the most talented horse coming into the Kentucky Oaks. She is the most accomplished horse coming into going into the Kentucky Oaks. The question that most fans have is, does she have what it takes to win at 1 1/8 from a pedigree standpoint? You will note from her 3 Beyer speed figures this year, there has been a regression from each and every start. From the career best 95 she earned in the 7 furlong Santa Ynez to the 89 Beyer speed figure she earned last week in the Santa Anita Oaks. It still has to be said, her 2 fastest races have come sprinting. Now, with an alert break, she is probably going to work out a good trip in the Kentucky Oaks. She has that wonderful tactical speed. But if you're trying to beat a favorite, that nagging question in the back of your mind is, does she really want 9 furlongs?
Yeah, and from a pedigree standpoint, I have, kind of no doubts about it. I'm not necessarily as worried about the Beyer regression. For last Saturday's race in particular, the track at Santa Anita, I think a little bit deeper, a little bit slower on Saturday. I think they weren't necessarily looking for her to go all out against that 4-horse field, looking toward having her fire a top performance in May. I'm actually more concerned about her shipping and running well. Last year at Churchill Downs, it was, just sort of a bunch of nagging little things, I think, caught up to her in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies, resulting in her 4th place finish. But I do still want to see her ship and win.
Oh, she is doubtlessly the horse to beat. Again, her credentials are obvious. From a speed figure standpoint, however, if you just go off the last race Beyer, she earned an 89 in the Santa Anita Oaks. Out for a spin, who paid $100 to win the Ashland, earned an 88. So it's not like she has such a tremendous edge on this field coming in if you just base off the Santa Anita Oaks, which is probably dangerous for handicappers that should always look at the overall body of work.
Yep. And, we just mentioned her. Out for a spin is the newcomer to this list. A lot to unpack from this Ashland as we watch the stretch drive. Out for a spin, I think, raced with the grain of the track on Saturday, but she still showed a lot of heart in the lane to turn back a filly who was a Grade 1 winner on this track over Restless Rider. I think Restless Rider should really move forward off this race, and I mean, what to make of Jaywalk, last year's champion 2-year-old filly, checking in 3rd there.
It was a very similar situation to Jaywalk's prior performance at Gulfstream, where she was the heavy favorite. She was expected to win. She did not run especially well in a gigantic long shot, picked up the pieces and grabbed the brass ring. Jaywalk looked beaten basically at about the 3 furlong pole. It didn't look like she was going to be running on at all. The fact that she ended up finishing 3rd, I'm not sure is the fact that Jaywalk stayed on, or the fact it's an indictment on everybody else that finished behind Jaywalk in this race. Like you, and I think like most fans that watch the Ashland, we want Restless Rider going into the Kentucky Oaks. That was her first start of the year for Kenny McPeak. She might not have been with the speed of the track that day. I think Out for a Spin got the jump on Restless Rider. Restless Rider ran just fine. Some folks might think she hung. She has run well at Churchill Downs. That was her first race back. We saw her win the Alcibiades Society, second off the layoff last year. We saw her win the Ellis Park Debutante and arguably her most visually impressive performance in her second lifetime start. It just looks like she's cycling up to the race the right way. The question I have for you about Restless Rider is, what do you think of her pedigree at 1 1/8 miles? I mean, her dam's a half to Private Vow, who did win a graded stakes going 1 1/16 miles, and the third dam was a graded winner at 1 1/16 miles. Do you think she has enough oomph to get that extra 1/16 of a mile?
You know, I think a lot of it is going to depend on the pace setup. And, you know, after watching her run on Saturday, I think she just might. I know talking to trainer Ken McPeak before this race, he said that, you know, maybe last year running her in that one extra race at Churchill after the Breeders' Cup, he says, you know, in hindsight, maybe I should have, you know, put her away for the year. Maybe it was, you know, going to the well one time too many. You know, so he really kind of backed off on her, freshened her up over the winter. You mentioned that this was her first start of the year. I think they would have liked to have won, but from, you know, the standpoint of moving forward into the Oaks, I think they got just what they wanted out of her. So, you know, I really do think she's the one who could move forward out of this race.
I agree. And getting back to Out for a Spin, because you never want to give short shrift to a Grade 1 stakes winner, no matter the price. This Virginia bred's got a lot of turf in the pedigree. You can see why they had her entered in a couple of turf races that got washed off. She's a half to a couple of black type earners on the grass. The dam was stakes placed on dirt sprinting, so there is the versatility. But I'm really not worried about the distance for this filly. We saw how game she was in the stretch, and the dam's a half to Bandini, who won the Bluegrass at 1 1/8 miles. So if you're looking for a long shot, Dallas Stewart knows how to throw out long shots on Derby and Oaks Week.
He certainly does. He definitely does. And, you know, Out for a Spin has definitely relished the distance. Her only unplaced effort was last year in a sprint. She was stepping up to graded company for the first time in the Ashland, but hasn't missed the board this year. And you mentioned her pedigree. You mentioned Bandini right there. Well, Out for a Spin is also by Hard Spun, you know, whose biggest win came at 7 furlongs, but he was multiple classic placed. And Hard Spun has sired the likes of Questing, Hard Aces, Wicked Strong, all top-level winners around 2 turns.
Are you just done with Jaywalk? I mean, this is now 2 races where it just appeared like she didn't really have a lot of interest. In the Gulfstream race, maybe she wasn't very aggressively ridden early, but she sat a great trip sitting in second, and when she turned into the stretch, the response wasn't there, and she sort of finished evenly. Here, she was able to get to the early lead. There was a key scratch when Chad Brown opted to run feedback the next day in the Sprinty Beaumont. That horse could have been a pace factor. Jaywalk was able to get to the lead, but she never really looked comfortable at all. She never looked like a winner, and yet she stayed on a little bit at the end. I'm sure the service barn is saying, well, it's great, now third off the layoff, returning to Churchill where she loves it. I don't know. I was going to give her the benefit of the doubt off the first race. Now I'm not so sure, especially if Serengeti Empress shows up at Churchill Downs.
Yeah, and you know, like you, I was very much willing to give Jaywalk a mulligan for her first start back off the layoff at Gulfstream, which, you know, some horses love and some horses don't. You know, I thought she was the standout coming into the Ashland. You know, again, I really was willing to give her that mulligan. And I mean, you know, look, it's still a Grade 1 placing in a major prep. She's still coming back to Churchill Downs where she thrived last fall. She's still a 2-year-old champion, but I feel like she's missing a little bit of killer instinct right now. And, you know, going into a dogfight like a top level race like the Kentucky Oaks is going to be, I really would have liked to see a little more from her on Saturday.
Maybe she was just an early 2-year-old and they've caught up with her now. I still think she has a lot of quality. She now offers some value if you still, you know, carry the torch going into the Kentucky Oaks. But I just hate to play horses in big races coming off subpar races.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, as we mentioned at the top of the show, a lot of movement still possible on this list as people finalize plans for their fillies. And for those scoreboard watching, one last chance to earn a spot in the field in the fantasy stakes coming up this weekend at Oaklawn, which will award points toward the Oaks to the top finishers on that 140-20-10 scale. And we'll be back to look at that race and its implications next week on the Oaks Countdown.